In the middle of a freezing blizzard in the wilds of Montana, a woman is left stranded on a train platform, holding only a letter promising love that has been blown away by the cold wind. No home, no family, no future. Only the bitter cold and a loneliness that seems to swallow her soul. If it were you, when all the doors are closed, what would you choose, to give up in despair, or to believe that somewhere there is still a hand ready to reach out in the blizzard? Sometimes, love comes not in roses and candlelight, but in the warm breath of a stranger who wraps a coat around you in the middle of the storm and changes your life forever. Can two wounded hearts find light again in the coldest land in America? And when the snow melts, will they dare to choose love again? Join me in the story. A mail-order bride was abandoned in the snow until a cowboy wrapped her in his coat and love. A story of loss, courage, and the miracle of love. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to feel this healing journey together. The wind had teeth that night. It howled across the empty platform of Red Willow Station, dragging ribbons of snow through the brittle grass and over the rails that hadn't sung in hours. The 7 o'clock train had come and gone, leaving only a single woman standing under the crooked lamplight. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had traveled 1,200 miles from Massachusetts with a heart full of duty and a small valise that carried every piece of her life that still mattered. A letter creased, smudged, and worn soft as cloth trembled in her glove. It bore the name Mr. Elias Thorne, Coyote Hollow Ranch, Red Willow Plains. The man who had promised to meet her was nowhere in sight. Clara lifted her chin against the wind, scanning the white blur that swallowed the horizon. Snow stung her cheeks, sharp as sand. Somewhere beyond the freight yard, a horse whinnied. Then silence again, that kind of silence the West keeps for strangers. She told herself to wait a little longer. Men could be delayed, storms could close a trail, trains could run early. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the lamplight dimmed and the station master locked his door. His parting glance held pity, not expectation. "Ma'am," he'd said, pulling his scarf tight, "you'd best find shelter 'fore the ridge disappears. Ain't safe out here once the wind gets up." She'd thanked him softly, though she had nowhere to go. Now she stood alone, a woman of 38 years, widowed, heart bruised by the small tragedies that don't make the papers. The train whistle still echoed in her bones. The letter in her hand fluttered once, then tore free, spinning into the dark. She ran a step after it, but the snow swallowed the paper whole. It was gone. Her breath caught. The simple act of losing that letter, the proof of her purpose, felt like losing her last bit of belonging. For a long moment she let the storm decide for her. The wind pushed. She leaned against it. Her boots sank past the ankle, then the calf. The world narrowed to white and the ache in her lungs. Every mile she'd crossed, every promise she'd whispered to herself, collapsed into that single truth she had been left behind. A horse snorted somewhere behind her. The sound cut through the wind solid, alive, deliberate. Clara turned. A tall man on horseback emerged from the storm, shape first, then color a bay gelding dark with frost, a coat of wool and rawhide, a wide-brimmed hat iced at the edge. The rider swung down in one practiced motion. Snow creaked beneath his boots. He didn't speak right away. His face was lined, wind-burned, eyes the gray of storm clouds. He looked like someone carved from the very land, someone who'd stopped counting winters. "Evening, ma'am," he said at last, voice rough but steady. "You plan to freeze here or ride with me?" Clara's first instinct was pride, the sort that kept her standing straight even when she shook. "I'm waiting," she answered, "for my fiancé." The man studied her, the way folks study a wounded bird that doesn't know it's hurt. "Ain't no wagons came through since noon," he said, "trails buried to the ridge. You got a name, Clara Whitmore." Something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or disbelief. "Whitmore. You were expecting a Mr. Elias Thorne, weren't you?" Her breath caught again. "Yes." He hesitated before removing his gloves. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm Elias Thorne." The words struck harder than the wind. She blinked up at him, confusion flooding into anger, then back into disbelief. You're him." He nodded once. "I didn't write that letter. My sister did." She thought he stopped, jaw tight. "You'd best come out of this cold. We'll sort the rest when daylight's back." She took a half step back. "So I was never meant to come." "Didn't say that," he muttered, looking away. "Just not the way it happened." The silence between them was as thick as the snow. Then he reached for his saddlebag, pulled out a heavy sheepskin coat, and held it toward her. "Here," he said simply, "before you turn to ice." Clara stared at the coat, at the man, at the storm swirling between them. To take it felt like surrender. To refuse it felt like suicide. Her hands, numb and trembling, finally reached. The coat smelled of smoke and horses and pine of a life lived outdoors. Warmth pressed against her shoulders, startling, almost intimate. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "It's a long ride, and the trail's mean tonight." He helped her onto the horse. The animal shifted beneath her, sure-footed despite the snow. Elias swung up behind, reins firm in his hands. The heat of him came through the coat, through the layers, steady as a heartbeat. They moved out into the storm. The lamplight from the station dwindled until it was only memory. Wind roared against her ears, but beneath that, she heard something else, the rhythm of hooves, the faint rasp of his breath near hers, a sound like a promise neither of them was ready to make. For miles they rode without words. When she thought she'd fall from exhaustion, he spoke again, low and certain. "Hold on. Clara Whitmore. Coyote Hollow ain't far." And for the first time since the train had left Boston, she let herself believe she might survive this night. Snow clung to Clara's lashes as the horse pushed through the drifts. The world had dissolved into gray and white. Sky and earth blurred into one endless storm. Elias rode close behind her, his arm sometimes bracing her waist when the horse stumbled. He didn't speak again, and somehow she was grateful. Words would have shattered the fragile thread of endurance that kept them both upright. After what felt like hours, a dim light appeared ahead, steady, golden, and real. The horse quickened its pace, nostrils steaming, hooves crunching over frozen ruts. The glow grew into a house 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with smoke curling from the chimney. Wind had carved drifts against the porch, but the windows burned warm. Clara could smell firewood and hay, and beneath that, the faint sweetness of coffee left too long on the stove. Elias swung down first, snow cracking from his coat. He reached up to help her, hands firm around her arms, lowering her to the ground. Her boots sank into the snow, her knees nearly gave way, and before she could protest, he steadied her again. "Inside," he said simply. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there slender, stern, hair pinned tight beneath a woolen shawl. Her eyes flicked from Clara to Elias, sharp and unwelcoming. Another stray. Elias, the woman said, voice cool as the wind outside. Mary Ann, he murmured. She was stranded at the station. Could have frozen. Mary Ann Thorne crossed her arms. And now you've brought her here, in the middle of the worst storm this winter. Lord help us. But she stepped aside. Get her to the fire before she turns blue. Clara stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a wallwood smoke, lamp oil, the heavy scent of stew simmering on the stove. The room was small but orderly, a long table, mismatched chairs, shelves lined with crockery and books. A kettle hissed softly in the background. Elias gestured toward the hearth. Sit. I'll fetch a blanket. Mary Ann studied her without apology. You're Miss Whitmore, then, the one who came here to marry my brother. Clara blinked. Yes, though it seems there's been a misunderstanding. Seems so. Mary Ann said. Her tone wasn't cruel, just tired. I wrote that letter. Thought Elias needed company. Didn't expect you to come halfway across the country on it. Clara felt the shame rise in her chest. I see. Then this is all my foolishness. Not foolish. Elias interrupted as he returned, draping a quilt around her shoulders. Just unfortunate. He hesitated, then added softly, Storm will pass by morning. You can stay in the tack room till not warm enough, and dry. Mary Ann shot him a look. The tack room. Elias. That's half buried. She won't mind, Clara said quickly. Surprising herself. I don't wish to intrude. Elias nodded. I'll show you. They crossed the yard again, lantern light trembling over the snow. The tack room sat behind the stable, a small cabin with a low roof, walls smelling of leather and oil. Inside, there was a narrow cot, a stove, and a single window iced from the corners inward. Elias lit the lamp, its glow turning the shadows gold. It's not much, he said, but it's warm. It's perfect, she answered. Her voice cracked on the word. He hesitated in the doorway, as though he wanted to say more but didn't know how. If you need anything, call from the porch. I'll hear. I will. He started to leave, then turned back, removing his hat. I'm sorry for the letter, he said quietly. Mary Ann meant well, but she had no right. Clara met his gaze. You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Thorne. I chose to come. Whatever waits here, it's on me. For the first time that night, something like respect softened his features. Rest, then morning'll look better than this. When he was gone, Clara sat on the edge of the cot. The stove ticked as it warmed. She unpinned her hat, brushed the ice from her hair, and looked around the small room. The air smelled of saddle soap and cedar shavings. A pair of worn boots stood by the door, one with a mended heel. Everything spoke of usefulness, not comfort. Yet she felt safer here than she had in years. Outside, the wind cried over the plains. She lay down, still wrapped in his coat, and let the exhaustion pull her under. At dawn, light spilled through the window, thin, silver, almost shy. Clara rose, dressed, and stepped outside. The storm had passed. The ranch lay under a white quilt, fences buried to the rails, smoke lifting steady from the house chimney. She could see Elias already at work, clearing the path to the barn with a shovel, his movements precise and tireless. He glanced up, caught her watching, and gave a small nod before returning to his task. Inside the house, Mary Ann was stirring the fire. "Coffee's hot," she said, still not smiling. "And don't thank me. I make it the same every morning." Clara sat quietly, warming her hands around the cup. The bitter scent filled her chest. She thought of Boston, the polished rooms, the quiet sorrow of teaching children who had everything but laughter. She thought of her husband's grave under the elm trees, the long winters of silence after. Coming here had been madness. Yes, but maybe madness was better than standing still. Elias entered, snow dusting his shoulders. "Roads closed till the drifts melt," he said. "Could be days. You'll stay here till then." Mary Ann shot him a look that could have cracked granite. "Days, Elias. People will talk. Let them," he said simply. "I won't send her out to freeze." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. There was a steadiness in his voice, the kind that left no room for pride. She lowered her eyes. "Thank you." "Help Mary Ann with the kitchen," he said. "Keep busy. It'll pass quicker that way." She did. The hours slipped by in quiet rhythm, the scrape of spoons, the hum of wind against the walls, the slow creak of floorboards that carried the sound of someone alive above them. The silence between the three of them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't cruel either. It was the silence of people who'd lost too much to fill it with words. That night, as she stepped outside to fetch wood, she looked toward the horizon. The sky was clear, a spill of stars over the dark line of the mountains. In that stillness, she heard the faint sound of a guitar, a slow tune, halting, searching, coming from the porch where Elias sat alone. The notes wove through the cold air like smoke, each one fragile, uncertain, yet deeply human. Clara stood in the snow, listening until the song ended. When she finally turned back to the tack room, her heart felt heavier and strangely lighter all at once. By the third day, the roads were still buried, and the sky stayed the same pale color as old tin. The world seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, Clara began to learn the rhythm of life at Coyote Hollow Ranch, a rhythm built on small things, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the hiss of the kettle, the steady beat of Elias's hammer as he mended a gate in the yard. He rose before dawn, always wordless, always deliberate. His days were spent outside with the horses, his nights beside the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring into the flames as if they might answer something he couldn't ask. Mary Ann ran the house with a quiet authority, her hands never still, her eyes always measuring. Clara kept to herself, yet she found comfort in small tasks, chopping vegetables, mending torn gloves, brushing snow from the porch steps. It was easier to move than to think. The storm had forced them together, but it had also granted her something she hadn't known she needed: stillness. One afternoon, she followed the sound of hooves and found Elias in the corral. The air was crisp, the snow crusted with ice that cracked underfoot. He was working with a chestnut mare, patient as stone, guiding her in slow circles. He didn't notice Clara at first. The way he moved, calm, unhurried, steady, reminded her of her father tuning a violin. Every gesture exact, every silence purposeful. When the horse finally stood still, breathing hard, Elias stroked its neck and spoke softly. "Easy now. No one's hurting you." The words were meant for the animal, but something in them settled deep inside her. Clara stepped closer, careful not to startle either of them. "She listens to you," she said. Elias turned. The brim of his hat shadowed his eyes, but she saw a hint of surprise there. "Only 'cause I listened first." She smiled faintly. "That's a rare gift." He shrugged. talk's easy. Listening's harder." She nodded, unsure what else to say. The silence between them was not empty now, it hummed with quiet understanding. She helped him refill the water trough, her gloved hands red from the cold. When she slipped on the ice, he caught her elbow instinctively. For an instant, their eyes met. She looked away first. That evening, Mary Ann served stew thick with potatoes and carrots. The three of them ate together. The only sound, the crackle of the fire. Afterward, Elias reached for a small wooden box near the hearth. From it, he drew a guitar. The instrument was old, one string replaced with wire, the finish worn smooth by years of use. "You play," Clara said softly. It wasn't a question, a little. He admitted, "Helps when the nights get too long." He began to strum, slow and deliberate. The melody was simple, an old frontier hymn, but his voice, low and rough, carried something more than the notes. It carried memory. Mary Ann looked away, her hands stilling on her lap. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt sacred. Clara whispered, "That was beautiful." Elias glanced at her, uncertain, as though praise were a language he'd forgotten. "It's just a tune," he said. "Sometimes a tune says more than 1,000 letters." She answered. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she saw how they caught him off guard. Later that night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat at the small window of the tack room, watching moonlight spill over the white fields. Her mind drifted to the life she'd left behind, the small house in Boston with its polished piano, the echo of her husband's cough, the sound of silence after the door had closed for the last time. Here, the silence was different. It wasn't absence, it was space. Space where she could breathe again. The next morning, she rose early and carried a basket of feed to the barn. Mary Ann followed her, surprised. "You don't have to do chores, Miss Whitmore. I need something to do," Clara replied, "and I'm not made of glass." Mary Ann studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Suit yourself, but don't let Elias see you lifting the grain sacks. He'll think I put you to work. I won't tell if you don't." A flicker of amusement crossed Mary Ann's face. "You might last here after all," she said, and left. Inside the barn, warmth and breath surrounded her. Horses shifted in their stalls, their bodies steaming faintly in the cold air. Elias appeared from the shadows, carrying a saddle. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He paused, watching her scatter feed. "You ever work a ranch before? Never," she admitted, "but I can learn." His mouth twitched. That's more than most folks say. They worked side by side in easy silence. Now and then he showed her how to tighten a girth or brush a mane. She listened, careful, her fingers clumsy at first but steadying. When she laughed at her own mistakes, he almost smiled. By midday, the snow had begun to melt in patches. Water ran down the troughs, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth. Clara stood outside the barn, feeling the sun on her face. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed warmth until now. Elias joined her, wiping his hands on a rag. "You plan to head back east when the roads open." She looked toward the horizon. That was the plan. But plans change. He nodded, though something in his jaw tightened. "You'd find the West quieter than you like. Maybe quiet is what I need." He met her gaze, and for a moment the air seemed to still between them. Then he said, almost to himself, "Maybe it's what we both need." That evening, Clara found a small bundle outside her door, a worn notebook. a stub of pencil, and a single wildflower pressed between its pages. There was no note, but she knew who had left it. She sat by the lamp and began to write small fragments of thought, half poems, half prayers. The words came slow, uncertain, like someone learning to speak again after too long in silence. In the distance, she could hear the guitar once more, its melody softer now, as if it were listening for her. She smiled without meaning to. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost inside her own life. By the end of the week, the storm had become a memory, buried beneath a sky so clear it almost hurt to look at. The land stretched wide and glittering, still touched by winter but whispering of spring. Coyote Hollow Ranch breathed again, fences visible, trails opening, the creek running with melt water. Yet inside the house, the air carried something quieter than before, a stillness that was not quite peace. Clara moved easily among the chores now. She had learned the rhythm of feeding the horses, of folding linens warmed near the stove, of chopping wood small enough to catch quickly. The body remembered such things faster than the heart did. Each task steadied her hands and quieted her mind. But when night came, and the world outside fell into shadow, she would feel the ache return, the ache of being somewhere between guest and stranger, belonging and departure. One afternoon, Mary Ann handed her a mending basket. "If your fingers still work after all that wood splitting," she said, not unkindly, "these shirts could use saving." Clara smiled. "I've mended worse. You'd be surprised what a widow learns." Mary Ann glanced at her. "You talk like a woman older than she looks." "I feel older than I am," Clara replied softly. The older woman studied her for a long moment. "My brother does too," she said finally. "He wasn't always this quiet, you know." Clara looked up from the torn fabric. "No used to laugh. Used to sing around the fire with our folks. Then the fever came. Took them both one winter. He never really came back after that." Mary Ann's voice softened, almost guilty. "That's why I wrote you. I thought maybe he needed someone to remind him he was still alive." Clara set down the needle. "And what about you? Did you need reminding too?" Mary Ann blinked, caught off guard. "Maybe," she admitted, "but I'm better at living with ghosts than he is." That evening, Clara stepped outside with the mended shirts folded neatly in her arms. The sky had turned to amber, the kind of color that holds its breath before the cold returns. She saw Elias at the barn door, brushing the mare's coat, his movements slow and patient. She hesitated, then walked over. "I fixed these," she said. "They'll last a while longer." He looked up, a hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You've been working harder than most folks who draw wages." "I like feeling useful," she answered. "It keeps the cold out." Elias nodded. "There's plenty to do here, if you're staying." The words caught her mid-breath. "If I'm staying." He looked down, adjusting the saddle strap. "Once the road's clear, you'll have choices. You might head back east, or not." Clara stared at him, the barn lantern flickering between them. And what if I'm not sure he met her eyes, then steady, unreadable? Then you take your time. No one's in a hurry out here but the wind. A horse snorted softly, and the spell broke. She turned toward the door, her pulse unsteady. "Good night, Mr. Thorne. Elias," he corrected gently. She paused. "Good night, Elias." That night, she dreamed of Boston again, but this time. The streets were covered in snow like red willow, And when she opened the door to her small parlor, it wasn't her late husband waiting there but Elias, coat dusted white, eyes steady as ever. She woke before dawn, her heart aching in ways she couldn't name. By mid-morning, she found herself in the kitchen with Mary Ann, kneading bread dough while the sun poured through the window. Elias entered, brushing off his coat. "Fence on the south ridge is down," he said. "Gonna take half a day to mend." "I'll come," Clara blurted before she could think. Both siblings looked at her. Mary Ann frowned. "That's rough work." "I've done rough," Clara said, wiping flour from her hands. "And I could use some air." Elias studied her for a beat, then nodded once. "All right. Dress warm." The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked along the ridge. The world stretched wide and silent. Mountains blew in the distance. Clara followed his lead, helping gather fallen rails, steadying posts as he hammered them back into place. Her fingers burned with cold, but she didn't care. She hadn't felt so alive in years. When the last nail was set, Elias straightened, breath fogging in the air. "You handle yourself well," he said. "Most folks would have quit halfway." She smiled faintly. "Boston winters are good training. Only difference is, back there no one listens to the wind." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "And what's it say to you, Miss Whitmore?" She tilted her head, listening, that maybe the world isn't done with us yet. A long silence followed, the kind that said more than words could. Elias turned back toward the ranch. "Let's get home before dark." They walked side by side through the snow, the fading sun painting long shadows across the land. When the house came into view, smoke curling from the chimney. Clara felt something stir inside her, a quiet certainty that she was no longer just passing through. That evening, as they ate in near silence, Mary Ann glanced between them and sighed. "Lord above, you two could talk a stone to sleep." Elias raised a brow. "We get along fine without chatter." "Fine," his sister muttered. "But someday, one of you ought to speak what's plain to see." He ignored her, but Clara saw the muscle tighten in his jaw. She lowered her gaze, a small smile tugging at her lips. Later, when the lamps were dim and the wind picked up again outside, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The stars burned fierce against the dark. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, the same coat he had wrapped around her that first night. Its weight comforted her. Behind her, the door creaked. "You'll freeze out here," Elias said quietly. She didn't turn. Not tonight. He moved beside her, standing close enough that their arms brushed. "You ever think about what brought you here all the time?" she whispered. "But lately, I think more about what's kept me here." He didn't answer, and for a moment she wondered if she'd said too much. Then, softly, he said, "Some things worth staying for don't always come with promises." She looked at him, the lantern light tracing the lines of his face, tired, kind, uncertain. "And some promises," she said, "don't mean much without the right person to keep them." Their eyes met. The air between them shifted, warm despite the cold. For once, he didn't look away. In that silence, the distance that had once stretched miles between them narrowed to inches. The thaw came slow but sure. Snow loosened its grip on the fields, and brown earth began to breathe again. The creek behind the barn sang louder every day. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt the world move forward, pulling her along with it, When Elias saddled the wagon one bright morning and told her they were heading into town for supplies, she hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Red Willow lay 10 miles east, a scatter of buildings hugging the tracks, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and strangers were measured by the way they carried themselves. As they approached, Clara saw faces turn curious, cautious, assessing. A woman arriving beside a man like Elias Thorne did not go unnoticed. Elias stopped the wagon outside the general store and climbed down. "Stay close," he said simply. "Town folks like to talk. I've lived through gossip before," she replied, trying to smile. "It can't hurt me. Words don't kill," he said, looping the reins, "but they can bruise. Inside, the store smelled of flour and kerosene. Shelves lined with tins and tools glimmered in the lamplight. Mrs. Crowley, the owner, greeted Elias with a nod and then turned her sharp eyes on Clara. "So, this the lady staying up at your place?" she asked. Her tone was friendly on the surface but edged beneath. Elias didn't rise to it. "Miss Whitmore's been helping us through the storm. We'd have lost half the stock if not for her." "Mrs." Crowley hummed, unimpressed. "A mail-order bride, wasn't she, poor dear? Stranded like that?" Clara's cheeks warmed, but her voice stayed calm. "I suppose everyone in Red Willow knows more about me than I do myself." The older woman blinked at her composure. "Oh, I meant no offense. None taken," Clara said. "I've found that the truth usually survives gossip better than people think." Elias's eyes flicked toward her, the faintest ghost of pride in them. They finished their shopping in silence, loading the wagon with flour, nails, and salt pork. As they turned down the main street, a group of men stood outside the saloon. One stepped forward, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered hat and a smirk too confident to be friendly. "Well, I'll be," he said, "Elias Thorne, riding into town with company. Ain't seen that since the fire." Elias stiffened. "Mornin'. Wyatt." Clara recognized the name from whispers. Wyatt Burke, owner of the neighboring ranch and a man whose reputation traveled faster than his shadow. His gaze lingered on her a moment too long. "So, this must be the bride that never was," he said, voice smooth as smoke. "Can't blame you for keeping her. Elias, beats drinking alone." Elias's jaw tightened. "Watch your mouth. Just saying." Wyatt continued, smirking. "A man like you needs company. Shame it's rented." Clara felt the words slice through the air. Before she could speak, Elias stepped forward, eyes gone dark. "You best walk away." Wyatt chuckled. "Still got that temper. Careful, or you'll burn more than Barnes this time." Something passed between them, something dangerous and old, but instead of striking, Elias turned back to the wagon. "Get in. Clara." She obeyed, though every part of her burned with humiliation and anger. As they rode out of town, silence hung heavy. When they reached open country, she finally spoke. "Why didn't you fight him because that's what he wanted?" Elias said. "Wyatt Burke's been itching for a reason to start trouble since my father's land stayed mine instead of his. So he insults me instead." Elias glanced at her, his voice low. "He wanted to hurt me, not you, but I won't give him the satisfaction of seeing it work." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "I can defend myself. Elias, I've lived through cruelty in finer rooms than that saloon." He looked at her then, a flicker of respect passing through his eyes. "I don't doubt it, Miss Whitmore." They rode in silence until the ranch came into view again, smoke curling gently from the chimney. The peace of it was a balm. But that night, Clara sat awake long after the lamps were out, replaying the day, the whispers, the insults, the strange pride she felt in his restraint. For the first time, she wondered what else he carried behind those quiet eyes. The next morning, Mary Ann handed her a basket of dough to rise near the stove. Town was buzzing, she said. Wyatt Burke's got a mouth too big for his boots. So I gathered. Clara replied, Elias ever tell you about him? Not much. Mary Ann sighed. There's bad blood. Wyatt's family tried to buy out this ranch after our parents died. Elias refused. Then the fire came. Folks whispered that maybe Wyatt's men were near that night. She met Clara's gaze, but my brother never proved it, and he never spoke of it again. Clara felt her stomach twist, and the woman he lost, Mary Ann, hesitated, voice softening. Her name was Grace. She died in that fire. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Clara pressed her hands to the dough, feeling it give beneath her palms, warm and living. Then he's not just quiet, she murmured. He's carrying a grave inside him. That evening, Clara found Elias in the barn, mending a bridle. The lamplight touched his face, half shadow, half gold. She hesitated at the door. I know about the fire, she said finally. He didn't look up. Everyone knows. I didn't mean gossip. I mean, I know you lost her. His hands stilled. The air between them thickened. Mary Ann told you. She thought I should understand. He set the leather aside, his voice rough. There ain't much to understand. A man makes one mistake, and people burn for it. Clara stepped closer. It wasn't your fault. He laughed once, humorless. You don't even know the story. Then tell me. He looked up then, eyes cold and bright. I was late getting home. Wind kicked up while I was out riding. By the time I saw the smoke, it was too late. I carried her out. But his voice cracked and fell to silence. Clara's throat tightened. And I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head, staring at the floor. Sorry don't change it. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but she knew better than to touch a wound that deep. Instead, she said quietly, maybe not, but forgiveness might. He looked at her as if the word itself were foreign. Forgive who yourself? He didn't answer, only turned away, shoulders rigid. But, as she left, she heard the faintest whisper so low she wasn't sure if it was meant for her or the ghosts still haunting him. I don't know how. Back in her room, Clara opened her notebook and began to write. The words came easily now. Sometimes surviving means forgiving what you can't forget. It was something he'd said once, long ago, when they were strangers on a stormy night. Now she understood it was a plea more than advice. She closed the book and blew out the lamp, listening to the wind scrape softly against the windows, as if the past were still trying to get in. The days stretched longer now, the snow thinning into patches of earth, the air smelling faintly of pine and thaw. The thaw meant work repairs, fences, and mud, but it also meant life. For Clara, it meant fewer excuses to stay inside and more hours beside Elias as he moved across the land with quiet certainty. Each morning he saddled the horses, handed her a pair of gloves that dwarfed her hands, and said, "Best learn how to keep up." She always did. They rarely spoke while they worked, but their silence had changed. It was no longer an emptiness. It was a thread between them, steady and invisible, made of small glances and unspoken understanding. He showed her how to mend a gate, how to calm a skittish mare, how to read the sky for storms. She showed him how to smile again, though neither said it aloud. That week, Mary Ann went into Red Willow for supplies, leaving them alone on the ranch. The house felt larger, quieter. At dusk, Clara stood by the porch rail, brushing wood dust from her skirt, when Elias appeared from the barn. The light hit his face just right, sharp jaw, silvered stubble, eyes softened by fatigue. He paused, as if unsure whether to join her. "Fence'll hold another season," he said at last. "I'll take your word for it," she replied. "You've built enough to know." He leaned against the rail beside her, close but not touching. The sky burned orange, fading to violet over the distant hills. For a long while they watched the sunset in silence. Then, far off, thunder rumbled low, uncertain. Elias's gaze shifted toward the horizon. "Storm brewin'?" "Another," she asked. "We just came through one. This one's warm," he said. "Spring storms come quick and mean." When night fell, the wind picked up, shaking the shutters. Rain struck hard, drumming on the roof. Clara sat by the fire, reading by lamplight, while Elias checked the latches on every window. The sound of the wind brought back a memory she didn't want that first night at Red Willow Station. The loneliness, the fear. She closed the book, listening. Outside, the horses neighed sharply. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing his coat. "Stay inside," he ordered. What is it could be, lightning spooked them. "I'm coming," she said, already rising. "No." His tone was firm. "I'll handle it." But Clara had learned something about him. His silence was armor, not command. She pulled on her boots and followed him into the storm. Rain slapped her face, the cold stealing her breath. The barn loomed ahead, its doors swinging open. Inside, the horses kicked and stamped, wild-eyed from the lightning flashing through the cracks. Elias grabbed a rope, moving with practiced calm. Clara went to the nearest stall, murmuring softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to soothe. A bright flash split the sky, followed by a crack so loud it shook the ground. Smoke drifted down from the rafters one of the lanterns had tipped in the wind. Fire licked along a beam. "Elias," she shouted. He saw it, eyes wide. "Get out." But she didn't move. She snatched a pail of water and hurled it at the flames. The fire hissed, but the heat grew fiercer. Smoke curled thick around them. Elias seized her arm. "Out. Clara. I won't leave the horses," she cried. "Damn it, woman," he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear, not anger. Together they fought a douse in the flames, she leading the animals into the rain. Every second stretched thin. The smoke burned her lungs. Her eyes streamed, yet she refused to stop. She heard him cough, stumble, then the crack of collapsing wood. Instinct drove her back inside. He was pinned under a beam, one shoulder caught. Without thinking, she wedged the shovel beneath it, throwing her weight against the handle. "Push," she yelled. He did. The beam shifted, rolled free. They staggered out into the storm just as the roof groaned and fell inward, a wave of sparks chasing them into the mud. Elias pulled her close, both of them shaking, soaked, and breathless. For a long moment they just stood there, rain washing the ash from their faces. The horses huddled nearby, trembling but safe. When at last he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You could have died." "So could you," she whispered, "but we didn't." He let out a shaky laugh, part disbelief, part relief. Then his hand came up to her cheek, rough and gentle. "Your trouble," Clara Whitmore, and your stubborn Elias Thorne." The words hung between them, bright as lightning. Then he leaned closer, just enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. For an instant she thought he might kiss her, but he stopped, his hand fallen away. "Let's get inside before the storm takes us both." Back in the house, the fire roared in the hearth, their clothes steaming as they dried. Clara sat near the flames, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Elias poured a measure of whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "Drink," he said. "You earned it." The liquor burned her throat, spreading heat through her chest. They sat in silence, listening to the rain ease. When the thunder faded, she spoke softly. "Why do you always step into danger like it's a duty?" He looked into the fire. "Maybe it is, to who he hesitated, to the ones I couldn't save." Clara set her cup down. "You did save them tonight. You saved me." He shook his head slowly. "Doesn't feel like enough." She turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it never will be. But that doesn't mean you stop trying." Something broke in his eyes then, a flicker of grief, raw and unguarded. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You remind me what it's like to breathe again," he said quietly. She felt her own breath catch. "And you remind me what it means to be seen." Neither spoke after that. The silence swelled, gentle and full, until it was all that remained. When she finally rose to go, he stood too, following her to the doorway. "Clara," he said softly. She turned. He reached for the coat hanging on its peg, the same she'd worn that first night, and draped it over her shoulders. "You keep ending up in my coat," he said with a faint smile. "Maybe it's safer there," she murmured. He looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe it is." That night, long after she lay down, she could still feel the warmth of his hand through the coat's heavy fabric. The fire's glow flickered across the room, and outside, the rain eased into quiet. For the first time, she didn't dream of the past, only of the sound of his voice saying her name. Morning broke pale and quiet after the storm. The world outside glistened with dew, each blade of grass beaded like glass. The barn stood blackened but upright, a testament to their stubbornness. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the faint ache in her shoulders. When she came downstairs, Elias was already at the table, his sleeve torn, his arm wrapped in a bandage. "You're hurt," she said, moving closer. He waved her off. "Just a scrape. Been worse." She sat across from him, noticing the way the light caught in his hair, streaks of silver glinting near his temples. The quiet between them was soft, fragile. Everything felt changed, like the ground itself had shifted while they slept. "You shouldn't have gone into that barn," he said suddenly. "Could have lost you." Clara's lips curved in a small, weary smile. "And if I hadn't, you'd have been under that beam alone. I wasn't about to let you die in silence." His eyes lifted, meeting hers with an intensity that pinned her breath. "You're the first person who ever said that to me." She hesitated, her fingers brushing the rim of her cup. "Maybe that's because you never let anyone close enough to say it." He looked away, the air filled with the tick of the old clock. Then, quietly, he said, "When Grace died, I promised myself I'd never ask anyone to live in my shadow again. It's a hard promise to break." Clara's voice softened. "I'm not asking you to." He stood, restless, crossing to the window. "You think I don't see what people say in town. Even Mary Ann tries not to show it. but she's afraid I'll lose myself again. People will always talk, she said gently. They talked about me, too, about the woman who couldn't save her husband, about the widow who ran from her grief. But I came here, and I found something I thought was gone. Elias turned, studying her as though her words were a language he hadn't heard in years. And what's that peace? She said simply, and someone who understands silence. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once, slow and uncertain. You make it sound easy. It isn't, she whispered. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. They said nothing more, but that day, when they went out to clear the fallen debris, their hands brushed now and then, and neither of them pulled away. By evening, Mary Ann returned from Red Willow, dust on her skirt and suspicion in her eyes. What in God's name happened here, she demanded, staring at the charred wood. Lightning, Elias said, caught the barn roof, and nearly caught you both, by the looks of it, she replied, frowning. You could have been killed. Clara stepped forward. We're fine. Mary Ann. We saved the horses. Mary Ann's mouth opened, then closed again. You both look half dead doing it, she muttered, but her tone softened. Suppose that counts for something. Later that night, Clara sat by the hearth mending a blanket while Mary Ann shelled beans beside her. You and my brother, Mary Ann began carefully. You've been through quite a lot together. Clara kept her eyes on the thread. The storm has a way of showing people who they are. Mary Ann studied her. Elias hasn't let anyone near him in 10 years, not since Grace. You've done more in a week than most have in a decade. Clara paused, her hands still. I didn't do anything except stay. Sometimes that's what matters most. Mary Ann said quietly, but be careful. He's not an easy man to love. Clara smiled faintly. Neither am I. Mary Ann gave a small, surprised laugh. Then maybe you're a match after all. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She slipped outside, drawn by the pull of the open air. The sky was full of stars, clear and sharp as crystal. She walked toward the fence line, where the ground still smelled faintly of smoke. She could hear the low murmur of Elias's voice. He was talking to one of the horses, soothing it with the same quiet patience he offered the world. You never stop working, she said softly as she approached. He turned, startled, then smiled. Habit. The animals don't judge. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her a moment, then rested his arms on the rail. I know. The night hummed with insects, the air cool against their faces. I keep thinking about what you said, she whispered. About grace, about promises. Do you really believe you can't love again? He exhaled slowly, as if the question itself weighed heavy. Love's not something you decide. It just happens or it doesn't. But when you've buried someone you swore your life to, it changes the way you see forever. Clara nodded, her throat tight. I buried mine too. I used to think grief was loyalty, but it isn't, it's fear. Fear that if you let go, you'll lose them twice. Elias's voice dropped low. And have you let go, I'm learning to, she said. Maybe that's all anyone can do. He turned to face her fully. You make it sound possible. It is, she whispered. If you're brave enough. For a heartbeat, the distance between them vanished. Then he stepped closer, slow as dawn, and took her hand. His palm was rough, his grip careful. Brave, he said softly. That's not what people usually call me. They should, she replied. It takes courage to keep living when the world's already taken everything. He looked down at their joined hands, then lifted her fingers to his lips, pressing a kiss that was more vow than touch. When he spoke again, his voice trembled slightly. "Clara, I don't know if I can give you what you deserve." She smiled sadly. "Maybe all we can give is what's left of us, and maybe that's enough." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You make a man believe things he's forgotten how to believe." "Then don't forget again," she whispered. He didn't answer, but his hand stayed in hers. They stood like that until the lantern burned low, until the cold crept back into the night and the stars dimmed with the promise of morning. The next day, Clara noticed something new in him: lightness. When he worked, he hummed softly. When he spoke to Mary Ann, there was a trace of warmth. He wasn't healed, not yet, but something had shifted. And when his eyes met Clara's across the table, there was no hesitation anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped low, he brought her the coat again, laying it around her shoulders without a word. It felt like more than kindness. Now it felt like trust. The first heat of summer came quietly to Red Willow Plains. The air shimmered above the earth by noon, and the smell of sage drifted through the open windows. Life on the ranch fell into a gentler rhythm. The days began with bird song and ended with the soft hum of crickets beyond the fields. Yet beneath the calm, something restless stirred like a river running under frozen ground. Clara noticed it in the glances from passing riders, the way the postmaster's eyes lingered too long when she fetched letters, and how the townsfolk's smiles never quite reached their eyes. The whispers had returned small, sharp, and merciless. She heard fragments whenever she went into town: the mail-order widow still living up at the Thorne place, or no ring yet, no preacher either. She pretended not to hear. She'd learned long ago that dignity was silence. But one afternoon, while trading for flour, the words turned cruel enough to draw blood. "She's got him under her thumb," a woman muttered near the counter. "Poor Elias always was soft for a pretty face. Maybe she's after his land." Clara froze, the paper sack in her hands trembling slightly. When she turned, the women fell silent. She forced a calm smile, but her heart stung. "It's kind of you to worry," she said softly, "but I think Mr. Thorne's quite capable of his own choices." Her voice was steady, but as she left, she felt something inside her shift, something heavy with shame and fear. She rode back through the dusty road, the wagon creaking behind her, trying to breathe through the ache. When she reached the ranch, Elias was repairing the paddock fence. He looked up at her approach, concern flickering in his eyes. "You're pale. Something happened in town. Nothing worth repeating," she said quickly, stepping down. He didn't believe her. "Tell me." Clara's hands tightened on her skirt. "They talk, Elias, about me, about you, about us." He frowned. "You care what they say. I care that they might hurt you," she said quietly. "You fought long enough to keep this ranch's name clean." He sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. "Let 'em talk. The plains are wide sound, don't carry that far." But she saw the muscle tighten in his jaw, the same way it did when he hammered fence posts too hard. "It's not nothing," she said. "I see how you look when folks mention grace. You already carry one ghost. Elias, you don't need another born from me." He turned sharply, his voice low. "Don't speak like that. You've done nothing wrong. Sometimes that's not enough," she said. Her voice trembled now. "Sometimes being right isn't what the world forgives." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, taking her face gently in his calloused hands. You listen to me. I spent half my life letting fear decide who I was. I'm done with that. If the town wants to talk, let 'em choke on their own words. Tears blurred her vision, but she managed a weak smile. You sound like a preacher. He smiled faintly. You've been rubbing off on me. She laughed softly, though it faded as quickly as it came. Still, maybe I should go for a while until people forget. The look on his face stopped her cold. No, he said simply. You leave now, and they win. But no, Clara, you belong here. He said it with such conviction that she had to look away, afraid of what she'd feel if she didn't. That night, she found herself sitting by the piano in the parlor, a gift left from the Thorns' parents, long untouched. Her fingers brushed the keys, uncertain at first, then sure. The melody rose slow, wistful, something between a prayer and a memory. Elias stood in the doorway, silent, listening. I didn't know you could play, he said when the last note faded. I stopped for a long time. She said, music hurt too much. What changed? You did, she whispered. He said nothing, but when she looked up, his eyes glimmered in the firelight, filled with something that scared her and steadied her all at once. The next morning brought a letter. The postmark read Boston. Clara opened it at the kitchen table, the paper trembling between her fingers. The letter was from her late husband's sister, a cold woman who'd never forgiven Clara for leaving the East. You've become a story. The letter read, a widow chasing a rancher in the wilderness. Have you no shame? Clara folded the paper carefully, then tore it into small, deliberate pieces. She fed them to the stove, watching them curl and blacken. When she looked up, Elias was standing in the doorway again. Bad news, he asked. No, she said softly, just ashes. For a few days after that, she moved through the ranch with a kind of quiet strength that surprised even her. She smiled more, spoke gently, worked harder. The whispers no longer mattered, not really. Yet one evening, as she was closing the barn, a shadow detached itself from the fence. Wyatt Burke stepped forward, hat low, grin crooked. Well, if it isn't the mail-order bride herself, he drawled. Didn't think you'd last this long. Clara stiffened. You shouldn't be here. I just came to talk. He leaned against the rail. Ain't fair, you know. A man like Thorne gets to start over, and folks treat him like a hero. But me, one mistake, and they say I'm poison. Maybe it's not the mistake, Clara said calmly. Maybe it's what you keep doing after. His eyes narrowed. Careful, lady. I'm not afraid of you. Mr. Burke, he smirked. You should be. You're a long way from Boston. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded behind them, steady, deliberate. Elias. He stopped beside her, his voice low and dangerous. You best be on your way. Wyatt. Burke's grin widened. You always had to play the noble man. Careful. Elias. That kind of pride burns houses. Elias took a step forward, and for a moment Clara thought he might strike him. But he didn't. His silence was sharper than any weapon. Wyatt's grin faltered. He tipped his hat mockingly, then turned and vanished into the dark. When they were alone again, Clara exhaled shakily. He wanted a fight. Elias's gaze stayed on the horizon. He'll get one if he comes back. She touched his arm gently. Don't let him take your peace again. He looked at her then, eyes softening. You keep saying that word peace? I start to think maybe you're what it means. She smiled through the ache. "Then promise me something. Anything. If there's another storm coming, and I think there is, don't face it alone." He nodded, the weight of the moment settling like the dusk around them. "Not this time," he said. By late August, the grass on the plains turned the color of worn gold. The air held the scent of rain that never seemed to fall, and even the horses grew restless under the heavy sky. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and silences longer. Clara noticed how Elias's shoulders tensed again, how his eyes darted toward the horizon each evening as if expecting something or someone to arrive. The run-in with Wyatt Burke hadn't left him. There was a sharpness to him now, a quiet watchfulness that made the nights uneasy. One afternoon, she found him mending a corral post that didn't need mending. "You've checked that fence 3 times this week," she said gently. He didn't look up. "Can't be too careful. Burke's been sniffing around. Jonas saw his tracks near the creek yesterday. Wyatt won't do anything," she said. "He just wants to scare you." "Men like him don't stop at words," Elias muttered. "He's a snake with a rifle." Clara stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. "And you're not alone anymore. Remember that." He looked at her then, and some of the hardness in his face eased. "You have a way of making me forget the world's as mean as it is. Maybe that's not a bad thing." The next morning, Mary Ann returned from town with news that made the kitchen go still. "Wyatt's been stirring talk," she said, setting down her basket. "Says you've been trespassing his north pasture. Says you took a calf that wasn't yours." "That's a damn lie," Elias growled. His voice was low but dangerous. "He's trying to push me into a fight." Mary Ann's eyes flicked to Clara. "And he'll get one if you're not careful." Clara swallowed hard. "Then don't give him what he wants." But the trouble found them sooner than she feared. That evening, a rider came tearing down the trail, a young ranch hand from a nearby homestead. His horse was lathered white, his face pale. "Mr. Thorne," he shouted, "Burke's at your creek. He's got 2 men with him. They're branding one of your yearlings right now." Elias grabbed his hat and rifle before Clara could speak. "Stay here," he ordered. "Elias, please, not this time," he said. His eyes were steel. "It's my land." Clara's breath caught as he disappeared into the fading light. The sun was sinking fast, bleeding red across the plains. She couldn't stand still. Every heartbeat echoed like thunder. Mary Ann tried to calm her, but the waiting gnawed like hunger. Finally, Clara saddled one of the mares. "Clara." "No," Mary Ann protested. "You can't ride out there. I won't sit here while he faces them alone," Clara said. "He needs someone who'll keep him from doing something he can't take back." The mare's hooves pounded the earth as she followed the faint trail toward the creek. The air crackled with tension, the smell of smoke, the sound of raised voices. She dismounted at the ridge and saw them below Elias, standing with his rifle low but ready. Wyatt Burke, broad and sneering, his hand hovering near his holster. "You got no claim here." "Burke," Elias said, voice carrying through the dusk, "that calf's mine, born on my land. Your land, Wyatt spat. Everything west of this creek used to be mine, till your daddy swindled it out from under me. My father bought it fair." "Fair?" Burke laughed bitterly. "You call grief fair? You took my wife's brother's place at the bank auction after he died." "You think I forgot?" Elias's voice dropped low. "You had 10 years to make peace. Don't ruin what's left of your name tonight." "Already ruined," Burke snarled, drawing his gun. Elias Clara's voice rang out before she could stop herself. He turned, startled, and in that instant, Burke fired. The bullet tore through the air, grazing Elias's shoulder. Clara screamed. Elias staggered but stayed upright, the rifle slipping into his grip like instinct. He didn't shoot. Instead, he stepped forward, bleeding, his voice like thunder. "You got what you came for. Wyatt, go home before I forget I still have mercy." Burke's expression wavered between rage and disbelief. "You're a fool," he hissed, lowering his gun. "One day that mercy'll kill you." Then he spat in the dirt and turned away, his men following him into the growing dark. Clara ran to Elias, catching him as he swayed. "You're hurt, just a graze," he said through clenched teeth. "Looks worse than it is." "Let me see," she insisted. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it to his arm. "You could have killed him." He looked at her, pain and weariness in his eyes. "That's exactly why I didn't." They rode back in silence, the moon rising over the plains like a watchful ghost. When they reached the porch, Marianne gasped at the sight of blood, but Elias waved her off. "It's done," he said. "He'll stay away now." Clara stayed with him while she cleaned and bandaged the wound. His skin was warm under her hands, his breath uneven. "You didn't have to protect me," she whispered. "You could have been killed." He caught her wrist gently. "I wasn't protecting you, Clara. I was protecting what you gave me a reason to keep living." Her throat tightened. "Then let me return the favor." She leaned forward and kissed him, not fierce, not desperate, but steady and certain. The world outside fell away. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before his hand rose to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. It was the kind of kiss that carried a lifetime of silence behind it, the unspoken grief of years, and the fragile hope of something new. When they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what happens next," he murmured. "Then we find out together," she said, for the first time in years. Elias Thorne laughed a sound low and rough, like gravel softening into music. "You sure you want a life like this? Droughts, storms? Men with more pride than sense I've already had a life without it," Clara said. "This one feels more honest." Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant and low, but this storm felt different, not a threat, but a promise. That night, when he finally fell asleep, she sat beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breath. Her hand brushed the edge of his coat, the one that had wrapped her that first night in the snow, and she smiled faintly. Love, she thought, wasn't always grand. Sometimes it was simply staying when the world tried to drive you away. Autumn crept in quietly, soft and golden, as though the land itself was exhaling after the long, restless summer. The cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow first, their leaves trembling in the faint wind. The ranch settled back into its rhythm repairs, harvest, and the low music of crickets after sundown. But for Clara and Elias, peace felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one careless breath. Elias's shoulder healed slowly. He refused to rest, though the bandage sometimes bloomed with red where the scab split open. Clara scolded him each morning, and each morning he'd answer with that half-smile that softened her anger. "Ain't the first scar this place has given me," he'd say, and go back to his work. The air between them had changed. There was no more pretending the kiss had stripped away whatever veil had lingered. But with that truth came an ache neither quite knew what to do with. At night, when the lamp burned low, Clara caught herself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, hoping and fearing he might come to her door. he never did. Sometimes she thought she understood it wasn't rejection, it was restraint, the same stubborn decency that marked every part of him. One evening, as she sat mending a shirt by the fire, Elias came in carrying a crate of apples from the orchard. The crop's early this year, he said. Might make cider before frost hits. She smiled. You sound almost cheerful. Guess I got reason to be, he said, setting the crate down. Town's been quiet. Haven't seen Burke or his men since that night. Clara set her needle aside. Do you trust that quiet? He paused. No, he admitted, but I'll take it. They shared supper together, just the two of them. The flicker of lamplight caught the lines at the corners of his eyes. The weary grace of a man learning to live again. When he reached across the table to pour her coffee, his fingers brushed hers. Neither pulled away. The moment lingered simple, domestic, full of the kind of intimacy that didn't need words. Later, when Mary Ann retired early, Clara and Elias stepped outside. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Overhead, the stars burned clear. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked suddenly. She turned to him, surprised. No. Do you sometimes? He said quietly. This ranch, it's all I've known, but sometimes it feels like a cage built out of memories. Clara's voice softened. Maybe it's not the land that traps you, Elias. Maybe it's the ghosts you keep feeding. He looked at her, eyes shadowed. You ever think the ghosts keep me? She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. Then maybe it's time to stop letting them. He exhaled, a rough, trembling sound. And what then? Then you live, she said. For once, you live for yourself. He didn't answer, but his gaze held hers long enough for her to see something raw there. Fear, maybe, or hope too fragile to name. When he finally turned away, his voice was low. You make it sound easy. It isn't, she whispered. But it's worth it. The following morning, a letter arrived from the county office, an invitation to testify before the land board regarding the boundary dispute with Wyatt Burke. Elias read it in silence, jaw tightening. He's making it official, he muttered. Wants to bleed me dry in court instead of with bullets. Clara reached for his hand. Then we fight him the right way. Law don't favor men like me, he said grimly. Burke's got money, friends in Helena. Then you'll have truth, she said firmly, and you'll have me. He met her eyes and nodded once. Then we'll go. The hearing in town was set a week later. Clara rode with him, her heart heavy as they passed through the familiar streets. People stared, whispering behind gloved hands, but she held her head high. Inside the small courthouse, the walls smelled of dust and old paper. Wyatt Burke stood at the far end of the room, clean-shaven, smiling like a man already certain of victory. The proceedings dragged on for hours' testimony, maps, sworn statements. Clara watched Elias speak plainly, his words measured and steady. When it came time for cross-examination, Burke's lawyer tried to twist every fact, painting Elias as reckless, unfit, a man whose past tragedies proved his weakness. Clara's hands clenched into fists under the table. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, Burke approached them with that same cold grin. Nice show. Thorne, he sneered, but you can't outrun the past. Folks still remember that fire. Elias stiffened, but Clara stepped forward before he could speak. Yes, she said clearly. They remember a man who tried to save someone he loved, not one who hides behind lawyers and lies. Burke's smirk faltered. "Careful, Mrs. Whitmore. You forget your place." "I've spent a lifetime remembering it," she replied. "Now I'm finally where I belong." The silence that followed was thick and cutting. Burke turned away with a curse, his boots echoing against the floorboards as he stormed out. That night, they stayed at a small inn on the edge of town. The wind rattled the shutters, and the smell of rain drifted through the window. Clara stood by the lamplight, brushing out her hair, when Elias spoke from the chair by the fire. "You shouldn't have stepped in like that," he said quietly. "Could have made things worse." She turned, meeting his gaze. "And if I hadn't, you'd still be standing there letting him tear you apart. You think silence is strength, Elias, but sometimes it's surrender." He stared at her for a long moment, then stood and crossed the room. "You've got a way of seeing through me I'm not used to." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's about time someone did." He stopped inches away, the firelight catching the scar on his temple. "What are you doing to me, Clara Whitmore?" "Maybe reminding you you're still alive," she said softly. He reached for her, then, no hesitation this time, no fear, and kissed her deeply. The world seemed to slow, the rain tapping gently against the glass as the weight of years fell away. When they finally broke apart, his voice was rough. "You know, this changes everything." "I hope so," she whispered. For the first time in a decade, Elias Thorne let himself believe in tomorrow. The verdict came 2 weeks later, carried on a folded sheet of paper that smelled faintly of ink and rain. Elias stood by the porch when the courier arrived, his expression unreadable as he broke the seal. Clara waited beside him, her heart a fist in her chest. He read the words once, then twice, then let out a long breath that trembled at the edges. "They ruled in our favor," he said quietly. "The land stays ours." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara's laughter, soft and disbelieving, spilled into the open air. "Elias, that's justice," he finished, almost whispering it. He looked out toward the horizon, where the mountains rose like the edge of another world. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day." Mary Ann came running from the barn, wiping her hands on her apron when she saw their faces. "It's done." "Then it's done." Elias said, "Burke can't touch this place again." But even as he said it, a shadow lingered behind his eyes. Clara saw it, though she didn't speak of it then. Some wounds don't heal with victory, they only stop bleeding. That evening, as twilight stretched across the plains, Clara found him sitting by the corral, a bottle half empty beside him. He didn't look drunk, just weary, like a man who'd finally set down a load he'd carried too long and wasn't sure what to do with his hands now that they were empty. "You should rest," she said softly. He glanced at her. "Can't seem to. Every time I close my eyes, I see fire. 10 years, and it still looks the same." She sat beside him, the boards creaking under their weight. "Maybe that's what forgiveness really is," she said after a moment. "Learning to see the same fire and not let it burn you anymore." He turned to her, something fragile flickering in his gaze. "And if I can't, then I'll sit with you," she said, "until you can." For a while, neither spoke. The night hummed around them crickets, wind, the soft rustle of grass. He reached for her hand and didn't let go. The simple weight of his fingers felt steadier than any promise. Days passed, quiet and golden. Clara began keeping small notes in her journal again, bits of thought, half-formed sentences that tried to capture the life they were building. A man and a woman who found each other in ruin, two hearts mending in the same silence. She didn't show them to Elias, but somehow he seemed to sense them in her voice, in the lightness that had returned to her laughter. Then, on an early October morning, everything changed again. Jonas the ranch hand came riding hard from town, dust rising behind his horse like smoke. "Elias!" he shouted before he even reached the gate. "Burke's dead." Elias froze. "What shot?" Jonas said, breathless. "They found him near the river. Sheriff says it wasn't no accident." The words hung in the air like thunder. Mary Ann crossed herself. Clara felt her heart drop, a cold unease spreading through her chest. Who, Elias asked. Who'd shoot him? "Sheriff don't know," Jonas said, "but folks are talking, saying maybe it was one of your men, or maybe you." Elias's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "I know," Jonas said, "but talk travels fast." By nightfall, the rumors had reached every porch in Red Willow. Some said Burke's men had seen Elias near the river that morning. Others claimed they'd heard the shot. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the story people wanted to believe. When the sheriff came riding up the next afternoon, his hat pulled low. Elias was already waiting on the porch. "Evening." "Thorne," the sheriff said, "need you to come with me." "For what?" Elias asked evenly. "Just questions," the sheriff said. "Nothing formal. I'm not hiding." Elias replied, "I'll answer what I can." Clara started forward, panic rising. "He didn't do anything." The sheriff's tone softened. "I know, ma'am, but Burke's brothers are in town, and they're looking for someone to blame. Best to clear this before things turn ugly." Elias touched Clara's arm lightly. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'll be back by sundown." But sundown came, and he didn't return. Clara paced the porch until the stars came out, each hour tightening the knot in her chest. Finally, she saddled a horse and rode into town, her lantern swaying in the dark. The streets were near empty when she reached the jailhouse. Through the barred window, she saw Elias sitting on a cot, his hands clasped, his expression calm but distant. "They said you'd come," he said as she approached. She gripped the bars. "They can't keep you here just till morning," he said. "Sheriff's letting things cool down. Burke's kin are drinking their grief into anger. He figures it's safer this way." Tears pricked her eyes. "This isn't fair. Life rarely is," he said quietly. "But don't worry, Clara. I'm done running from ghosts. Let them talk. I've got nothing to hide anymore." Her voice trembled. "I hate that you always face things alone." He smiled faintly. "Not alone anymore. You're here." They talked until the sheriff called lights out. Before she left, she reached through the bars and took his hand. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. When this is over, we leave. Start fresh somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one knows our names." He hesitated, then nodded. "If that's what you want, it's what we need," she said. "The land can live without you, Elias, but I can't." He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was softer than she'd ever seen. "You're stronger than you know, Clara Whitmore, and you're kinder than you believe. Elias Thorne." When she rode back to the ranch, dawn was beginning to touch the hills. She stopped once, looking back at the faint outline of the town. Somewhere behind those walls, the man she loved was facing the ghosts of 2 decades, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that before the sun set again, everything would change. The morning after Elias's arrest dawned gray and heavy. Mist curled low over the valley, swallowing fences and fields, leaving the world soundless and strange. At the ranch, Mary Ann paced the kitchen, her hands wringing the edge of a dish towel until the fabric nearly tore. "They'll twist it. Clara," she said, "you know how this town is. They'll make him into the villain because it's easier than finding the truth." Clara stood by the window, her palms pressed to the glass. "Then I'll go find the truth for them." Before Mary Ann could protest, Clara pulled on her riding cloak and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting. Her mind was steady, too steady. Fear had sharpened into something fierce and clear determination. She rode hard toward Red Willow, the hoofbeats echoing across the empty land. At the sheriff's office, she demanded to see Elias. The sheriff, a weary man with eyes like tired gravel, sighed. "He's not charged, ma'am. But Burke's brothers are riled up. They think justice means a rope." "Then why haven't you stopped them?" she snapped. "Because I'm one man," he said evenly, "and this town's half built on grudges. I'm keeping him here till tempers cool." "Where were the brothers last night?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "Home, far as I know." Clara's jaw tightened. Then they couldn't have done it themselves. Who was with them? The sheriff hesitated. A drifter called himself Dale. Worked Burke's spread a few weeks, then vanished after the shooting. Could be nothing, could be everything. Clara didn't wait for permission. She turned and left, the door slamming behind her. Outside, Jonas was waiting, hat in hand. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "That man Dale, he knew the creek routes," Clara said. "He'd been up here for deliveries. He'd know how to make it look like Elias." Jonas nodded grimly. He was bragging in the saloon 2 nights back about Burke's money troubles. "Maybe there's your reason." They searched until dusk, questioning ranch hands, listening for whispers. Finally, at the livery, an old stable boy mentioned seeing Dale hitching a horse headed north toward the mining trail. Said he was done with ranch work. The boy muttered, "Had a heavy saddlebag, though." Gold Jonas guessed could have been coin, the boy said, or guilt. By nightfall, Clara and Jonas had tracked the trail to the foothills beyond Red Willow. The sky burned copper as the sun sank, and the air smelled of pine and gunpowder. They found a small campfire by a dry creek bed, and beside it, a man cleaning his pistol. "Evening," Jonas said, voice low. The man looked up, startled. He was lean, unshaven, eyes darting like a fox's. "What do you want?" Clara stepped forward. "The truth." He laughed, but it came out thin. "Lady, truth's worth less than water out here." "Maybe," she said, "but it's worth more than your freedom if I tell the sheriff where to find you." He hesitated, jaw twitching. "You got no proof." Clara's voice steadied. "I don't need proof. I've got the sheriff's word you were with the Burkes, and I've got enough sense to know men like you don't stick around unless they've got something to run from." Jonas moved closer, hand resting on his holster. "You shot Wyatt Burke, didn't you?" Dale's eyes flicked between them, sweat beading on his temple. "He owed me," he spat. "Promised me pay when the land deal went through. Then he said the Thorn Ranch was his for the taking. He thought I wouldn't pull the trigger. He was wrong." Clara's stomach twisted. "You let them blame an innocent man." Dale shrugged. "Better him than me." Before she could answer, Jonas moved fast. He wrestled the gun from Dale's hand and tied his wrists with rope from his saddlebag. "You'll tell that to the sheriff yourself." Dale scowled but didn't resist. You think anyone in that town will believe a drifter over a ghost story? They need a villain. He's already built for the part. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. Then I'll remind them what the truth looks like. By dawn, they'd brought Dale back to Red Willow. The sheriff met them on the steps, surprise flickering across his face. You found him? He confessed, Clara said, voice hoarse. He killed Wyatt Burke. The sheriff looked from her to Dale, then back again. You've got witnesses, me, Jonas said, and the man himself. The sheriff nodded slowly, relief mingling with disbelief. Well, I'll be damned. Inside the jailhouse. Elias rose from the cot as they entered. His eyes widened when he saw her dusty, exhausted, but radiant with purpose. Clara, it's over, she whispered. They know the truth. He looked at the sheriff, who gave a quiet nod. You're free to go. Thorne, seems Miss Whitmore here did my job for me. Elias turned to Clara, wonder and gratitude warring in his expression. You rode into the hills alone. I wasn't alone, she said softly. You were with me every mile. When they stepped out into the pale morning light, the town was waking. Word spread fast Elias Thorne was innocent. The widow had cleared his name. Some people stared. Others tipped their hats. For the first time, Clara didn't care what they thought. She'd found something truer than reputation. They rode home in silence, the wind cool and sharp against their faces. At the ranch gate, Elias stopped his horse and turned to her. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. Clara smiled, then earned me. He laughed soft, almost disbelieving. Reckon I'll spend the rest of my life trying. That evening, as the sun bled gold over the horizon, Mary Ann brought out 2 mugs of cider. You both look like you wrestled the devil and won, she said. Maybe we did, Clara replied, glancing at Elias. He met her gaze, the last of the day's light catching the faint scar along his cheek. Feels like we left the ghosts behind for good. Not behind, Clara corrected gently, just farther away. The 3 of them sat on the porch, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full like the hush before rain. Somewhere down by the creek, a wolf howled, long and low. Elias reached over, his hand finding Clara's, and for the first time since winter's storm had brought her to his door, she didn't feel like a wanderer anymore. She was home, names for continuity. Clara Whitmore, 38 widowed piano teacher turned fearless advocate, rescues Elias by uncovering the real killer, Elias Thorne, 46 rancher wrongfully accused, freed by Clara's courage and ready to rebuild his life beside her. Snow came early that year. It drifted softly across the valley, blanketing the scars of summer and fire alike. The land, once rough and loud, seemed hushed under the weight of white. Clara stood on the porch one morning, wrapped in Elias's old wool coat, watching flakes spin through the cold light. She remembered that first day she'd arrived here frozen, frightened, a stranger left behind by fate. Now, the same snow felt different. It wasn't a punishment, it was a promise. Elias came up behind her, his boots crunching in the frost. Looks like it's setting in early, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. It's beautiful, Clara whispered, like the world's catching its breath. He smiled faintly. Reckon we earned a quiet season. They had. The weeks after his release had passed in a blur of rebuilding mending fences, restocking feed, settling accounts that had lingered like ghosts. Word had spread of Clara's courage. People in town now greeted her with respect instead of whispers. Still, she rarely went to Red Willow. The ranch had become her world, and she liked it that way. Mary Ann teased her often, saying, "You look more like a thorn than the thorns do," and maybe she was right. The prairie sun had browned her skin. The wind had learned her name. Some nights, when she played the piano after supper, Elias would sit nearby, eyes closed, listening not just to the music, but to the peace it brought him. One evening, while she was drying the dishes, he leaned against the doorway and said, "You ever think about what comes next?" Clara glanced over her shoulder. "You mean tomorrow or forever?" He chuckled. "Both, I guess." She set the towel down. "Tomorrow I'll bake bread, and forever." "Well, I suppose that depends on you." Elias's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time I ask proper." He stepped forward, pulling a small velvet pouch from his pocket. Inside was a simple silver band, nothing ornate, just honest and strong, like the man himself. Her breath caught. "Elias, I ain't much for speeches," he said quietly, "but you saved me, Clara, from ghosts, from myself. You turned this place from a grave into a home. If you'll have me, I'd be proud to call you my wife." Tears blurred her sight, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. "You don't need to ask twice," she whispered, smiling through it. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling just slightly. "Guess it fits, like it was meant to," she said. The wedding was small, held right there in the ranch house. Mary Ann baked pies, Jonas brought cider, the local preacher came riding through the snow with his Bible tucked under his coat. The ceremony was simple, the vows quiet and steady. When Elias kissed her, the room seemed to exhale every loss, every fear, every lonely year dissolving into warmth. Afterward, the neighbors lingered for food and laughter. The piano played long into the night, and Clara's voice joined the hum of it all. Outside, snow fell in thick, slow flakes, softening the world into something new. Later, when the guests had gone and the fire had burned low, Elias and Clara stepped outside. The stars were so bright they seemed to hum. She leaned against him, his arm circling her shoulders. "Do you ever think about that night I arrived?" she asked softly. "All the time," he said. "You looked like a ghost walking out of the storm." "I felt like one," she admitted. "I didn't think I'd ever find warmth again." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "And now I think the storm was what led me home." Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, but the house glowed with light. Clara spent her mornings sewing and her afternoons helping Elias with the horses. They laughed often small, ordinary laughter that filled the rooms like sunshine. Sometimes, at dusk, she'd sit by the window, writing in her journal. "I used to believe love was something that arrived in grand moments. But now I see it's built in quiet hours, the touch of a hand, the steady rhythm of footsteps beside yours, the sound of someone breathing in the dark. On Christmas Eve, the first in many years that felt truly alive." Mary Ann placed a quilt over the back of the couch, a gift she'd been sewing for months. Its patchwork told their story: a house in snow, a trail through mountains, a pair of hands clasped beneath a sky of stars. Clara traced the stitches with her fingers, tears glimmering in her eyes. "It's beautiful." Mary Ann smiled. "Every square's a memory. You've given us a lot to remember." That night, they all shared supper by lamplight. Elias lifted his glass and said quietly, "To new beginnings, and to the woman who walked into my storm and stayed." Clara's voice trembled as she answered, To the man who waited long enough to be found. They drank, the moment tender and full. Outside, snow fell heavier, muffling the sound of the world. Inside, the air smelled of pine and cinnamon and something eternal. When they went to bed, the ranch lay silent beneath the moon. Elias reached for her hand as they drifted into sleep. "Still think the storms follow you," he murmured. She smiled in the dark. "No, I think they brought me where I belonged." And, for the first time, he believed her. In the months that followed, spring came soft and slow. The thaw returned. And, with it, life, wildflowers across the meadow, calves in the fields, laughter echoing in the open air. Clara planted roses along the porch, saying every home needed a little beauty to remind it of its scars. Elias built her a small writing desk facing the hills, where she could see the horizon and remember how far she'd come. One afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of blooming sage, Clara found him near the barn, hammering a new sign above the gate. It read Thorn Hollow. Beneath it, carved in smaller letters, were two initials, E and C. She ran her fingers over the wood, her heart swelling. "You named it for us." He shrugged, a little shy. "Seemed right. This place ain't just mine anymore." She smiled. "No, it's ours." He looked at her, sunlight catching in his gray-flecked hair, and said softly, "Never thought I'd get to see this kind of peace." Clara took his hand. "It's not peace, Elias. It's life. The difference is, this time, we get to live it." And as they stood there, watching the wind roll through the golden grass, the world felt whole again. Not perfect, not without pain, but real, and theirs. The story, A Mail Order Bride Was Abandoned in the Snow, is not just the journey of a forsaken woman and a lonely man. It is the journey of every broken soul. It reminds us that pain is not the end, but the beginning of rebirth. That there are people who come into our lives, not to save us, but to remind us that we can still love, can still believe, can still live. In the silence and peace of the West, the story teaches us a simple thing. The greatest power sometimes lies not in words, but in the quiet presence of sincere love. If this story warms your heart, please leave a like, share to spread the love, and subscribe to the channel to continue the healing journey together, where we believe that, no matter how thick the snow falls, there is always a fire waiting to warm the human heart.